It's so nice to be out of the dark times, where even trying to build a PC for $1,000 or more meant you were scraping the bottom of the bin to try to get in a reasonable graphics card. Well, graphics cards prices have come so far down in the last couple of months that we can now start out today's budget build at $700. I'll talk to you about where you could maybe scrape a few dollars off if you needed to, but in general, I'll talk about where you can actually spend a little bit more if you don't like some of the compromises that I made here. Now, let's pop into PC Part Picker, where I've thrown together a list. By the way, not sponsored by them or anything. It's a very handy place to throw together a build. Anyway, so what did I do here? So first of all, I think the biggest place people spend too much money on a budget build is on the CPU and the motherboard. Because, and you'll get a lot of opinions on this, and I get that some of you watching this video might disagree with me, but here's the thing. You have to cut money somewhere if you're doing a budget PC. And most likely, if you're not buying a super expensive graphics card, you are going to be GPU limited, not CPU limited, in most gaming situations, which means if you spend a whole bunch on a CPU, then you're just wasting that money. And people will say, well, it increases the longevity of the system because you can upgrade further GPUs in the future. And maybe that's the case, but I'd rather buy the best PC I can now and enjoy it for a couple of years before worrying about whether I lost a small amount of upgrade potential years down the road. Although obviously just spending more on your PC now will make it last longer. But anyway, with that in mind, I've selected my CPU as the Core i3-12100F, and yes, this is a quad-core processor, and I know many of you are going to absolutely hate this. Let me pull up a review and talk a little bit about this. 10-game gaming average 1080p, and they put on a high-quality GPU, so we're not GPU limited here on these tests. And you can see that on average in their testing, the 12100F, despite being a 4-core, 8-thread CPU, was actually beating an 8-core, 16-thread CPU like the 3700X or a 6-core, 12-thread like the Ryzen 5 3600. It's absolutely smashing the i3-10100F from a couple of generations ago. And this is, delivering similar performance to a 10600K, 11600K, all of that. Now, why is that the case? Because despite this being 4 cores, it does have 8 threads, and each of these cores and threads is very fast because Alder Lake is fast. And now it is true that in a game that can actually take advantage of more cores than this CPU has, that these other CPUs will gain on it. But because each core and thread is able to do more than CPUs that have more cores, right? But each core is slower. Here's a game like Cyberpunk, which actually is able to hammer the CPU a lot harder than most games are. And we'll see here that the 12100F is still on par with something like a Ryzen 5 3600 or Ryzen 7 3700X. And yes, it is now losing pretty significantly to the 10600K, but it's also still delivering very good performance here, even in the 1% lows are way above the 60 FPS target that most people would be shooting for on a low budget build. I don't want to spend forever on this, and thank you to TechSpot for this good review. This is not my benchmark data, just so nobody's confused. But that's basically it. That combined with the price. Guys, it's $100. Find me a $100 CPU that beats this one, and I'll throw it in my build. But you're not going to find one because there isn't one. Now, some of you will argue you could spend a little bit more and get a cheaper motherboard. And I looked into it. Yeah, fine. Okay, let's talk about the motherboard. So there's a lot of arguments that the motherboards for Alder Lake are way too expensive. And yes, this isn't one of the best ones. And yes, there's even cheaper ones that are even worse. But here's the thing. I'm running a 12100F. So if you're arguing that, oh, these VRMs suck for overclocking, well, I'm not overclocking. And these VRMs suck for a 12900K. I'm not putting a 12900K in this build. This motherboard will do absolutely fine. Now, I will bring up, this is one of the places you could spend slightly more money on the motherboard. You could also spend slightly more money on the CPU. you, but I'll get to that at the end of the video. Basically, you could spend about 20 bucks more on the motherboard, and then you could buy a 12400F instead, and yes, it will be significantly better. But it also raises the price. Now, for a budget build, I still think going with 16 gigabytes, 2x8 configuration of memory that's at least DDR4 3200 CL16 makes a lot of sense, and that memory right now is cheap. It's only 50 bucks. 32 gigabytes is nice, and it's actually not that much more money, an extra maybe $40 or $50. But once again, everywhere you add in that little bit extra price, just if you add in an extra 50 bucks on every single component, your build ends up being hundreds of dollars over budget. But again, that's another place you could do it. Just swap that up to 32 gigabytes, or if you're looking for more competitive esports type performance where you're turning down all the settings and pushing frame rates, then I think instead of going for more RAM, you might go for faster RAM, faster speeds and timings. Now, here's another place where I've really cut things down. I don't think it makes sense to just go with the hard drive. You do want an SSD, and NVMe SSDs are not much more money than SATA SSDs. And there's some decent 500 gigabyte models. I'm saying decent, not amazing, but fast enough for your boot drive and your games. And for a 500 gigabyte model, you can get them for around $40, like this one here. However, I will say that modern games are going to fill up a 500 gigabyte SSD incredibly quick. So if you save money by getting a 500 gigabyte model now, you are absolutely going to have to buy more storage soon if you install more than just 1 or 2 games at the same time. So I would actually recommend, again, another place you could do it is bump this up to a 1 terabyte drive at least, and that'll bump it up about $30 or so on the price tag. Now, the graphics card is going to be the biggest choice and the biggest factor in your gaming experience. Basically, your PC games will perform as well as your graphics card can, unless you get a graphics card that is so much more powerful than your CPU that your CPU can't feed the graphics card. So basically, as long as your CPU is good enough to not bottleneck your graphics card, then your graphics card is the #1 thing affecting your gaming performance by far. And this is where the prices have come so much farther down lately. The RX 6600, I own one. I actually own this exact model. I've benchmarked it thoroughly on my channel. And this card absolutely is a better choice than the RTX 3050 when the RTX 3050 costs as much or more. Now, their MSRPs are $80 apart. The RX 6600 MSRP was $329.99. The RTX 3050 MSRP was $250. That's an $80 gap. The thing is, though, the RTX 3050 regularly sits in the $300 to $330 price range, and the RX 6600 for the last week or so has actually been $30 below MSRP at $300 consistently, which means that the RX 6600 is delivering better performance for the same or less money. So unless you absolutely have to have NVIDIA, this is the GPU to get. The better ray tracing performance on the 3050 is completely irrelevant in my opinion at this price point, because of the performance at this price point. These cards are already going to be working as hard as they can just to play the game without ray tracing. That adding in ray tracing to further decrease their performance doesn't make a lot of sense. And yes, DLSS is better than FSR 1.0 and has much wider implementation than FSR 2.0. And at 1080p, it looks better than FSR 2.0. But the thing is, neither of them look that good at 1080p. So personally, I would be trying to play at the native resolution here anyway, and the RX 6600 is the one that's more likely to be able to do that at high settings for a long time without having to rely on DLSS in order to bring the performance up. Now, if you do want to check in on the RTX 3050, currently the lowest price one I see available, again, is almost $20 more than what I'm seeing for the RX 6600. Another option you can look into is getting a 2060, possibly used. The main disadvantage of that is going down to 2 gigabytes of VRAM, and it's going to be slightly slower than the RX 6600, but it's a much better competitor. So if you did want to go the NVIDIA route, maybe you want to stream and use the NVENC encoder, that would be a reason you might want to do that. Maybe use some professional software that works better on NVIDIA's CUDA cores. There's definitely software out there that is optimized for NVIDIA and not for AMD. Or you just have a brand loyalty here that you want to go with. Well, then I would actually personally probably go with the 2060 if it costs about the same as the 3050. The main disadvantage there, once again, is losing 2 gigabytes of VRAM, but I do think the overall performance is actually stronger. But once again, in my personal opinion, since I wouldn't be relying on things like DLSS or ray tracing at this price and performance tier, I think AMD's main disadvantages are kind of moot at that point, and so it's faster rasterized performance for less money makes absolute sense, and I shouldn't load 2 of them into the build. Okay, let's go ahead and talk cases. Now, I am not a case expert, but I wanted to go with a cheap case. And even the cheapest cases that I could find on PC Part Picker are usually at least about $40. But the thing is, most of the cheapest cases don't come with fans. And if your case doesn't come with fans, you're going to have to buy fans anyway. Which then you might as well just buy a more expensive case that had fans. So it looks like this case actually comes with a couple of reasonable fans, and it also has a mesh front and an acrylic side panel. This isn't the most amazing case in the world, and I have not built in it personally. However, as far as I can tell, there is no reason to believe that this couldn't get the job done. It has fans. You can add more later if you need to, like I didn't see a fan in the rear that you might want to add in, something like that. Now, power supplies. We don't need a lot of power for this build. The main advantage to if you wanted to spend more on a power supply would be to be able to upgrade your GPU and even your CPU to much more power-hungry components in the future without having to buy a new power supply. And honestly, installing a new power supply in an already built PC is one of the more annoying upgrades to do as far as just the ease of doing it. So you could definitely do that. However, this decent quality EVGA, we're from a trusted brand here, 80 plus gold, fully modular power supply. It's 550 watts, is absolutely fine. Guys, the RX 6600, I have this exact model, and it never goes over 100 watts, okay? And this CPU is not drawing a lot of power either. This is more than enough power for this build as it is. But again, if you wanted to upgrade in the future, you could definitely buy a more expensive power supply. Now, the thing is, by making all of these little cuts, like I told you, we're actually getting this build in at $700. Okay, $713.42. But I think that this will be a very, very solid 1080p gaming experience. In most games, you'll be able to play them at ultra settings. In some of the newest, most graphically demanding titles, you'll want to turn down to the high settings. But other than that, this is going to crush it. If you're just playing esports a lot of the time, you will be able to get high frame rates in esports titles, especially by turning down the settings as you usually would in that scenario. I think this is absolutely fine. So if this was me building it, what would I do differently? Okay, so first of all, if my budget was $700, this is exactly what I would do, and that's why I started with it, and that's what I'm recommending for it. However, the number one things that I would upgrade would be this in this order. For me, 500 gigabytes is just not enough storage. Now, you could do this upgrade in the future, but personally, I would just rather have a terabyte to start with. Now on PC Part Picker, if you're using that, you can adjust the filters to give you at least 1,000 gigabytes, and then you can adjust prices. If we zoom out here a bit, price low to high, but then you can also click the SSD button. And then I've actually already looked at this earlier today. And I'll say that I looked in, again, there's these SATA drives, but it's not that much more expensive to get the NVMe drives. Now, I looked in the speeds on some of these drives, and like this Team MS30 is $70, but it's way, way slower than the Silicon Power A60 for $74. So for only $4 more, this one is going to be delivering much, much faster speeds. Now, to be clear, there's still much faster Gen 3 SSDs out there, but for just general boot drive and playing games, this is going to be fast enough. And again, that brings us up to $744. So I would personally at least make that upgrade. Now, if I was going to upgrade from here, the GPU is going to be the most impactful upgrade, but the problem is that as we increase the GPU, the pricing steps aren't small. You're going to have to jump up a pretty big amount in order to get the next upgrade here on your GPU, but it could be worth it if there's any deals. The 6600 XT can sometimes be found for pretty reasonable prices. Right now, it's still at its MSRP of $380, so that's an $80 jump. That is pretty big, but it would offer a pretty big performance jump. It's pretty comparable to a 3060. It's actually better, and that's not really a 3060. But 3060s are about $20 more. The 6600 XT will be faster in rasterized performance, slower in ray tracing. And at the 3060 level, you may or may not use ray tracing in some titles, so that could be relevant to you. And then from there, we're just getting into much more expensive build territory, which I've covered or will cover in other videos. So the other place we could look here is the CPU and the motherboard. So if we want to stick with Intel here, we could go with the 12400F. The other option would be to go with a Ryzen 5600 from AMD. And that's a perfectly viable option. I'm just going to go ahead and go with the Intel chip here. And then the thing is that this motherboard definitely can run this 12400F just fine. However, if we bump this motherboard up another $20, I think that this is going to help increase the upgradability of this system if you wanted to upgrade it in the future. And a lot of people have, agree that the MSI Pro B60MA is one of the best budget boards for this platform. Now again, making that upgrade has pulled us up to the $834 range along with our 1 terabyte hard drive. And so right here, we're doing pretty well. This will be a better system, but actually your gaming performance here is pretty similar to what we were seeing at the start. Because we haven't upgraded the video card. And so if you do really want to realize some of those better CPU gains before having to wait until the next generation or whatever comes out, or a GPU upgrade, well, you could upgrade the GPU now, and that's where I will throw in, you could go up to the 6600 XT rather than the 6600. You're going to be about 19% faster. And now we're up around $915. So you guys can see, first of all, where, how just increasing every little bit, a little bit added to the CPU, a little bit to the motherboard, a little bit to the storage, a little bit to the video card, and suddenly our $700 build has increased in price by $200. So budgets can get absolutely blown out of proportion very easily on a PC build. So you see why I started where I did, and I absolutely stand by those recommendations. By the way, I've been recommending stock coolers here because, again, a stock cooler really isn't going to noticeably increase your performance. It's on this level of CPU and as well as the 12100F, and it's going to add another $20 to $50 to spend, depending on how much you want to spend on that. It could decrease the volume of your PC, the fan noise, if you want to get a better cooler on that. And increase, help your temperature stay under control. So this build definitely is better than the $700 build. Whether it's worth that extra $200 to you is going to depend on your budget. After this point, you could jump up to either faster RAM or up to 32 gigabytes of RAM. And then past that point, if you did want to get a faster GPU, which, by the way, I think at this point, the 12400F can support anything, literally any GPU that's out right now, even up through like a 3080 class. I think I'd be absolutely fine recommending it for that. And then, but if you do start to increase the GPU from here, I would recommend also bumping up the power supply. But we're no longer into budget build territory at that point. So I think I'm going to end the budget build video right here, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.